Yeah, it's the one. It's where I first met Wilf because I did it in Morgan. I got the historic corridor. What do you call them? Oh my gosh, it'll come to me in a second. It's been one of those days.
Are we live now? Okay, I got the signal that we're live. So, just like to welcome everyone to the January 12th, 2023 meeting for the Planning Commission. This is our first meeting for the year, so just like to wish everyone a happy new year. And we have acknowledge there's a couple people in the audience here with us, and then anybody that's joined online. So welcome, thank you, and glad you could participate with us in the meeting tonight. We'll have the first item of business be the approval of the minutes for the December 8th, 2022 Planning Commission meeting. So hopefully the Planning Commission members have had a chance to review those minutes. So we can discuss that if there needs to be any additions or deletions, but if they're good, I would entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
So you got a approval from Commissioner Lyon.
I'll second the motion.
A second from Commissioner Branch. And so let's just do a voice vote. So all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? So that approval is unanimous. Go to the next item of business, which is a preliminary plat subdivision for the Carling subdivision located at 97 East Crestwood Road. So we'll turn over the time to the staff to do their report.
All right, I think we're familiar with this property. It just came through, that's my stomach, I don't know if you heard that, sorry. It just came through rezone. It was approved by the council, I think on December 8th, at the December 8th meeting. And now it's back for preliminary plat for subdivision. It was rezoned to R16, and the property is 0.34 acres, just shy of 15,000 square feet. Actually that is incorrect because it says that it's zoning R18, but it's R16 now. There is one other property within the city that's zoned R16. I think I mentioned when we talked about this here in the Planning Commission that if this was approved, it would be the first property, but there is one other property that's zoned R16. This is just an aerial shot of the property there at the corner of Crestwood and Fairfield at the northwest corner. And then this is the subdivision, the preliminary plat. Engineering has reviewed this, so his zoning, it does meet the required lot sizes, widths, and the recommendation from staff is that Planning Commission forward a recommendation of approval, but with one condition, which is that the detached garage be modified to meet setback requirements before the final plat is recorded. There is a detached garage on the property, and I think about 2 feet would need to be removed to make it meet setbacks with the subdivision. So we would require that modification be made to the detached garage before we would record the final plat. So if there's any questions, I can answer those, or we do have Mr. Curling here in the audience tonight to answer questions as well.
How much does the garage have to be modified?
Can you repeat your question? I'm Brian Curling.
How much does the garage need to be modified?
Well, it'll either be 2 or 4 feet.
Okay.
If you look at that flat subdivision, we tried to make it as clean as possible, but we didn't want to get rid of that garage.
Right.
Buildings are horribly expensive, so we think it'll either be because the roof trusses in 2-foot increments, either 2 or possibly 4.
Okay.
My son that's going to live in it wants to keep his shop as deep as he can. So.
Okay.
Cool.
And seeing that it is only your second R16, the other R16 was a real funky jigsaw boundary. This one we tried to, I've been in your shoes, I've been serving years ago with the Planning Commission. We tried to keep it simple. We didn't want to have anybody up in arms of disapproval. We think it will lend itself to have a nice, we're hoping that like a colonial style home. I will not be the builder. I don't have enough money to do that. I think it's a nice corner that will set itself as something nice. The new lot that will be established.
Melinda, when does the planning or the city council consider the rezone?
It's already been approved.
Oh, it's
To
done.
R16,
Oh,
yeah.
okay, so it's, so, all
I
right.
think that.
So where it says here that the existing zoning is R18, that's,
Yep,
oh, it says R16 on here, I guess I'm the
Sorry,
one.
that was mine.
Okay, all right. Very good.
pretty much don't trust anything we're saying right now. Yeah, so it is R16 right now.
Okay.
That was approved last month.
Great.
And then Mr. Carling did mention at the, I don't know if it was planning commission or city council meeting, but the detached garage it's like block, CMU block.
Cinder block.
And so it'll be pretty easy to just, well,
Yeah,
relatively
we just have to
easy.
post the south end of that, make sure we have support, and they also have funky windows, so that's, some may crumble, we may have to rebuild, we'll do our very best.
You just have to reset the wall and then move support and reset it, yeah,
And that's why the 2-foot increment, we'll figure out which truss.
based on your truss size, okay.
But it will make it look nicer from anybody looking from the south, because this is 99 years old, it's not, the garage is not old, but we're trying to just make it better. It'll take some time and money.
Any other questions for the applicant before we have him sit down? Okay.
Mr. Chair, I move that we recommend approval of the preliminary plat for subdivision for the Carling subdivision located at 97 East Crestwood Road with the conditions of the setback for modification of the garage as recommended by staff.
Okay.
Second.
All right, we have a motion for approval, recommend approval and a second. We'll start the voting with Commissioner Lyon.
Aye.
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 All right, so the motion passes unanimously. So congratulations, you got your preliminary plat approval.
Come on, Brad.
Come on, you got to have one member here. Okay. All right, so next item of business is a public hearing for a text amendment to Title 17, Chapter 32, sign regulations. So before we have that public hearing, we'll let the staff do their report.
First of all, my apologies for the late delivery of the staff report. So, but this is, and the staff report was very simple. We're working with a project that would be adjacent to the West Davis corridor, just off of 200 North, 3 acres of general commercial that's zoned out there. And in discussion with the individuals that are developing that property, and then the height of the West Davis corridor, which is going to be with the parapet walls and everything, it's going to be about 28, 30 feet above the grade of 200 North. So the main change to this chapter is that we would increase the sign height allowance up to 45 feet like we do along the I-15. There's just a few other kind of housekeeping items that I wanted to mention to the Planning Commission as well, but the language in the chapter talks about the zoning administrator, but I'm just changing that to the community development department so that if we change titles, it's just a little bit more fluid with what changes we may have in the city organization. There's also a portion that talks about having a public hearing with the Planning Commission if there is a violation of a lighted sign. We're just taking that out. We would handle that through our other means, which would be, staff would investigate, and we would work with the city attorney if we needed to do anything further than just trying to get that into compliance. And then one thing that we are trying to do, it'll be coming to you probably at the next meeting, is we're going to push all of the conditional use approvals to be administrative at staff level. So I've already incorporated those changes into this chapter, and then, like I said, the main thing is just that we are recommending that the sign height be that it match what is allowed near the I-15. So if there's any questions,
The reason what I ask is, when they did State Route 67, which is the legacy, I was in the process in Morgan of putting in scenic byway over State Route 66 and 65 that connected that into Parley's. And Nika Roundy at the time was working on that one to protect it, because it then protects it from having the signage. So I'm just asking, is there any movement, is the county or anybody working on scenic byway designation, extending that scenic byway out off of Legacy onto West Davis? Because it would kind of negate that, because you can't have that kind of signage off a scenic byway. And I'm just wondering if they want to protect that view shed from that.
yeah, that's a good question, Commissioner Lane, and I do not know the answer to that. I will say that I know that with the legacy highway design, there was a lot of environmental stakeholders that were
Yeah.
involved and lawsuits. And my guess is that was probably a compromise to,
It came later.
Well, and it was,
Oh, yeah,
it was
it came-
also put in as a scenic
Scenic
corridor.
corridor to preserve, and the reason they did that was, you've got lighting for birds and lighting for, you've got that lighting that comes with the signs that is not conducive to bird migration.
okay,
And so when you have it on that wetland corridor, which it is, everything west of the West Davis and Legacy becomes wetland corridor. You're effectively messing with the birds' navigational systems. And so I'm curious to see if there should be, I mean, this is, kind of the conversation,
that's a really good question.
a scenic byway, and there should be conversations at the county level so the county can spearhead that, because it does navigate multiple cities, and then the city should coordinate that between Farmington, Kaysville, Layton, Clearfield, and up into West Point, west where it terminates,
Yeah.
and Syracuse, so that we're not all, we're passing these ordinances, I get they're critical, but also that we're also protecting viewshed on that west side.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything about whether they're going to, that they have talked about putting that into the scenic corridor.
Yeah, I mean, they're not hard to do, but it could just be an extension of that legacy.
Yeah.
I just texted Nika Roundy, who put that in place when she was at the county. She said Gary Uresk potentially is former, Gary.
Yeah, I know Gary.
Gary may be working on that behind the scenes, but I think it might be a conversation with the county on your
Yeah.
side with Jeff Euler, who answers his phone calls. So anyway,
That's a really good question. I did just send a text to Josh and Dexter to see if they know anything. They've been more involved with the corridor since it's under construction, but obviously if it is, this would not.
I know, and then I'll go back. When I did the one for Morgan, the Morgan part of these byway, that it gives you that corridor. I think it's 50 feet either side that you cannot put a sign. And so, I mean, it's critical for that, for some of these habitats.
So I can say that the signage, the easternmost boundary of the property is about 450 feet east of the West Davis corridor. And so to meet that 300 feet, well, now I'm second guessing myself. Let me pull this up. Okay, I'm just going to pull it up on Google. We'll measure that. So that could definitely change what we're attempting to do here, although
Just wait for it to be put in place.
let me just do a quick measurement here. Yeah, it's 450 feet to that eastern part of the parcel, which is on, it's West Gate Lane. So even to meet that 300 feet, they'd have to put it towards the western part of their parcel. Can look up something else. Is that scenic byway regulated by federal regulations, or is it
State and federal,
the state? Okay.
and then it falls under some federal. That's where the federal highway funding comes in with it.
Okay. Well, obviously that would, if it is the case, that would make it so that our ordinance wouldn't apply. This is the parcel that we're talking about. It's a C-store that's looking at coming in, and they're also going to subdivide the property and have the easternmost 2/3 of the property would be the C-store, and then the other portion would be left for some other type of development. And you can see here the kind of the footprint of what the West Davis corridor is looking like. So this parcel is about 450 feet wide. So that's a good question. I don't know if the commission wants to table this until we find out, or do a conditional recommendation. Either way, it's your preference.
Is there any preference there? I mean, that's what I was going to maybe suggest the tabling, but we could do the conditional, approval as well, so.
Okay, Public Works doesn't know the answer to that question either, so.
Yeah, I'd prefer to table it.
Okay. I would entertain a motion for tabling it.
I'll make a motion that we table this item until we gain more information regarding the question posed by Commissioner Lyon.
Second.
Do you want to do a date specific? Wendy was asking me a question, so I don't know what the motion was, sorry.
Yeah, just that we postpone at least until next meeting until we
Okay.
get more information
So until
regarding this
the
question.
26th.
Questions
Yeah.
answered,
Okay,
yeah.
yeah, so this is a public hearing, so we do want to make sure it's date specific.
Abby, you want to say anything?
No, so what we can do also, if you want to just make a motion to keep the public hearing open until the 26th.
Yeah, you could
So
certainly
that,
do that.
or you can hold the public hearing when nobody's here. But I think we would want to just make sure that we take care of that public hearing as well.
Just advertise it again on the 26th as a public hearing.
Yeah, we can do that too. We'll do that.
So, sorry, just make sure I understand. What do I need to do something here, like
No, I think we'll just, you just can vote on the motion as you just said.
Okay. And then we'll
we'll
postpone the public hearing to when we take this up again?
26th.
Yeah. Okay. So we have a motion and a second to table. Let's start the voting with Josh.
Aye.
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 All right, so then the motion is unanimous to table that item. So the next item of business is a public hearing for a rezone application for a text amendment for Title 17, Chapter 27, mixed-use zoning district overlay.
Yes.
Turn the time over to staff.
Okay. I don't know the easiest way to do this other than probably just go through kind of paragraph by paragraph, or if you, come on. Right, here we go. So I will, just kind of a brief overview. First of all, I did make a couple more changes today based on some comments with the city attorney. I found a typo, I fixed that, and we can go over that as we discuss this. But let me tell you what I know about mixed use. Mixed use is very tricky to get right. It's very site specific. And so trying to write a code as a one size fits all can be a big challenge. There is a caveat in the ordinance that essentially says that if the city council sees fit and finds that other standards would be preferable, that they could essentially adopt anything. But I think that it's best to have as much spelled out in the code as possible so that when people are working on a project, they know those parameters and can bring a good project forward. The purpose paragraph, I think, just has a couple of, grammar and small fixes. What I was attempting to do with this second section is to just delineate everything that the developer needs to bring forward to have a complete application. We received an application in August, but it's incomplete. I mean, there's no project, there's no site plan, there's no anything. And so I wanted to make it very clear that the developer will need to bring all of these items to the staff before we even take forward or accept an application before we take that forward to the Planning Commission. So that was my intent with this first portion. And I think, like I said, it might just be easiest to kind of go through the ordinance just kind of page by page to see what comments. There are a couple different discussion points that I would like to see what the Planning Commission prefers as far as what requirements we put forth with commercial space. Very pleased that we just had this mixed-use project that was passed over here just north of Smith on Flint Street. They were able to make the project work, and I think, again, because of how site-specific it was, if they were trying to do mixed-use over the entire portion of the parcel, it would have been a different outcome. It would have been a lot more difficult to make a mixed-use project work, but the way they carved that up and put the mixed-use portion fronting Flint made it work. So, this too, I think, is just kind of like trial by error, and sometimes you don't know how well written or how flawed your ordinance is until you put a project through it. So, just from this last go around and some of my experience with mixed use, this is what I'm recommending. So, I don't know if you want to just go on from this section or if there's any questions about this portion. All right. Again, trying to work with like best practices of what the APA is and the state. Experts in the state are telling us we're trying to push away from conditional uses altogether. So this portion, I've essentially just tried to put what was listed as conditional uses into the permitted use side. And then it gets a little bit confusing because we have our different caveats depending on what the base zone is. So in RM, I think in general, when you're talking about mixed use, we really would like to have complementary commercial retail uses along with the residential. And so, having conditional uses like restaurants or restaurants that would sell beer, or maybe even like a bodega or a convenience store that might sell beer, I think that's something that we would want to have that would be permitted. Again, full service restaurant, limited service restaurant, those types of things. I think we can just put in the permitted section. Amusement arcades. Another one that was not listed that I think would be motels or hotels. And I can't remember if that was in the mixed or in the conditional use portion. Yeah, it was, but I just pushed that up to the permitted uses. And the nice thing about this mixed use zone is that we do have a lot of flexibility with bringing forward a project back and forth with staff and the developer to make sure that those, if there are any impacts, that they would be mitigated through that process. And so putting some of these from conditional into the permitted use, I think just, like the whole development agreement that's required with this type of a development essentially can allow us to apply additional conditions if we see fit. I see your
A couple of things. I mean,
wheels turning.
yeah, the project in St. George that I worked through, there's a couple of things. And it's just, in the one is on height regulation. Is that 12-foot height in the main floor high enough? Because I know for venting, if you're going to have a restaurant, you've got to have that venting height. And are you able to get the vent stack in there and all of the HVAC in that 12-foot? Because if not, that we ran into this in a project in St. George, and I'm trying to remember if 12-foot or 13-foot was needed. I think it was 13, because you can go to 12, but then you've got to have that extra 12 inches in there. So I think we might want to adjust that by a few, even if it's a half a foot, to allow the construction for International Building Code, just so we're within that clear height on that.
Are you talking about the height?
Yeah.
The height regulations?
Height, on your height regulations?
Yeah, I mean, I think normally commercial space is like 13 feet tall, but we don't have anything that prohibits them from doing a taller ground
Okay.
floor commercial space, but we do have that minimum of 12 feet that it has to be.
Okay. I just want to make sure that we're not restrictive. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, we got in on a project, and then St. George wouldn't allow us to go. They said, well, our minimum's here, and they want to give us a maximum. And we were like, well, your minimum, yeah. It was like negotiating. It wasn't negotiating. And then the other one was signage. There were some signage issues. I think as long as there's some flexibility, I mean, we just had our signage ordinance, but some flexibility for signage for businesses, allowing them that. Because when you get that residential mixed use, sometimes you get that, well, this is residential versus, you know, where you're coming in, where you're sometimes bridging between two uses. So like Flint Street, where you have houses to that, we need to make sure that there's a good way so that if there's a bright sign versus a lighted sign versus whether we can regulate the hours on those. So there's not a disruption to people, but also allow for the advertising in the business. It might be that you turn the sign one way or turn the building to allow for that. There's some ways around that.
I don't think that signage is really regulated much in the mixed use zone or chapter. I think it's just in our regular sign code chapter. There is a provision, though, in that sign code chapter that any project that's over 5 acres that we can do a conditional use permit for signage on the entire project. So if it's a larger project, right? I mean, the one on Flint Street was 6.4 acres, so that could have been one. I know we have the property over here off of Northwest that Phil Holland owns, and I'm trying to think what the square footage or what the acreage is on that, and I think it's about 4. But that's definitely something, you know, we don't want to have. You can have conflicting uses, right, when you start marrying that residential with commercial and retail, and so you do want to be sensitive to what. It's 5.6 acres. You do want to be sensitive to what signage you put in.
When we put the mixed use next to Josh's house in the historic district, we don't want the flashing neon signs to disrupt his family.
Yeah, and like I said, really the signage isn't covered in this chapter. That would be in the sign code. So should I just kind of move on from this section then?
Yeah. Sorry.
And then, you know, we have this provision about phasing. We just want to make sure that, right, like I had a project in another community I worked with, and they had the parking garage that was the 3rd phase of the project. And so the developer built the first 2 phases high-density apartments and walked away, never built the parking structure.
Because the parking structure costs more to build than the
Right, and
first two phases.
there's no ROI in a parking structure. So this gives us the ability to be, I think, several things. One, to make sure that the city is getting what the city wants out of the project, and two, to be able to be sensitive to, like we've had a couple of weird years, you know, with supply chain, with certain things. And so given market conditions, we may be a little bit more flexible with some of the phasing, or we may not, but this gives us the ability to dictate what the phasing would be through the development agreement.
We don't want an Orem 360.
Oh, yeah, I mean, that was awful. That was years of half-built,
Pain.
yeah, and, you know, millions and millions of dollars of lawsuits. So for anybody who's not familiar with that, Steve's referring to a project that was on State Street in Orem between 4th South and Center Street, and it got kind of, I think in the 2007,
2008.
It got caught up in that and bankruptcies, and that thing sat half-built for
Midtown.
10 years. So, you know, that would be one, you know, obviously you never know what's going to happen. So you do your best. Thankfully, that project down there is completed, and I think it looks pretty nice now.
Yeah, they turned it into a parking garage.
But it was a decade of challenges for Orem City to get through that. So this gives us the ability to just to be project specific, you know, market specific with the development agreement.
As part of your ordinance, do you require the developer to show you their pro forma?
We don't have that listed in here, but we could.
I just speaking from experience, I ran into that both in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Atlanta with
They require that?
with the municipalities back there, looking at our pro formas in review with the cities. It was kind of interesting to go through that process.
The only time I've ever had that required was when the redevelopment agency or the city owned the property and they were going to convey it through a development. So we certainly could, but
I just didn't know if that was.
yeah, it's not required in here.
Okay.
So this next section is similar to the uses as we listed above with the general commercial and city center or city central commercial. So I essentially just pushed the same things from conditional to permitted, and you'll all recall we went through removing pets from the land use code, so I cleaned that up in here as well. And then we're just allowing some additional things, light industry research, recreational vehicles, subject to provisions of Chapter 31. This is where I think it really starts getting complicated. We've had these formulas of 50% or more of the square footage of the development should be for commercial use. First of all, I don't know if that means 50% of the overall square footage of the entire parcel. I don't know if that means the footprint of the building. I don't know if that means the square footage of commercial space in relationship to residential space. And so it's undefined, and so we need to define that, but it's very challenging, as I said, to try and not knowing what specific property we're talking about, not knowing what frontage that has, to try and put forward some type of a formula that would yield a good project. One of the things that I've experienced in other places is, you know, you just would require commercial space on all of the road frontage. Well, some of those roads may not have good commercial viability or good retail viability, and so then you end up with commercial space that would sit vacant for a long period of time. And maybe we're okay with that, maybe we're not, but I think the goal here really is to get a good, successful, sustainable project. And vacant commercial doesn't really do a whole lot for anyone. And so one of the questions I have that I just wanted the commission to banter around with is, like, what is the best way to calculate square footage? Do we want to have this formula that's left in there with the 50-30 or the 50-50, or do we want to have it be very project specific and staff negotiates that with the developer and brings a project forward. I've had, like I said, full street frontage required. We've amended code in other places that I've worked because that full frontage of commercial requirement just didn't work well. We've also, I've learned that, if you want to have your whole ground floor commercial, well, commercial spaces most of the time, a 40-foot depth is adequate. And so then you would have a bunch of commercial space, back of house, or just commercial space that's not usable when that could have been maybe tucked under parking, that type of a thing. And so how we go about this is really a challenge, and especially with with Wilf and Steve who've done a lot of this. I don't know what your thoughts are with that, but my takeaway from all the projects I've worked on in mixed use is that it's just really tricky to get right.
I think you've got to rely on the property, because not every property is the same. And you've got to sometimes rely on, I don't know, it's the way the developer comes in with the project. And sometimes they're going to have a tenant in tow, and sometimes they're speccing it.
Yeah, and I mean, just to again kind of show the commission, right? The Flint Street Flint Street project had quite a good amount of frontage. This is the Phil Holland property that we know we're working on. It's got good visibility from the I-15, but here's the only frontage they have is the south half of a cul-de-sac. So what's a good use of this property? You would want something that would, that would be visible from the I-15, but if you had a frontage requirement here, they wouldn't be required to provide much commercial space, and the rest of it could be used up with residential. And so, as you said, as I've said, it's very site specific. If we were to maybe have some redevelopment at some of the places over on Main Street, it'd be a different story, right? Because we have, no, I'm a little bit lost, but we have good frontage, good vehicle traffic counts, but depending on that parcel, it may or may not be a good requirement. Like on the corner of Bowman's, we have, I'm totally lost here.
The Romney property.
There we go. Right, we have this street. So wait, okay, yeah. So this 300 West, that would be street frontage. So we could say, look, if you're going to redevelop this parcel, you'd have to provide a certain amount of, ground for commercial based on this frontage and this frontage. But this 300 West really isn't good viability for retail or higher intensity commercial. And so would that yield a good project? I don't know. So this is where I think it just gets really tricky, but no matter what we do, I think we need to define it, because like I said, this is, 50% of the square footage of the development. It's kind of open-ended, and the way I think it's written, well, that would lead me to say, like, okay, you could do 50% of the entire square footage of the whole parcel, but then do we count surface parking into that? And so I put on there, we don't want somebody to come in and build a huge sea of parking and say, well, that's my commercial space, and then you have a teeny tiny commercial building. So I'll just let the commission just maybe toss out some ideas and see if we can come to a good place. You're very quiet tonight.
I don't know. I mean, I go back and look at, like, in Massachusetts and these other states now, they're getting rid of their parking requirements. I mean, it's becoming more common. They're saying the developer, you kind of know best, but they're doing it by development agreement. I think there has to be somewhat parcel by parcel, but I also think that you have to put in a standard and say, we want, and it depends, based on your frontage or based on, there has to be some kind of standard that is in there, because if you're in redeveloping the property, how are you going to do that? Because you want to attract development. You attract development through your ordinance. Well,
yeah, and the truth is if somebody came in and they had an LOI or something with a really great business that we would love to have here, but it's got a small footprint, we may be willing to make concessions to not have 50% commercial and have more residential. And so that's why what I've done is just the final mix of commercial and square footage, will just be determined by the development agreement. I don't know if that's the best approach, but I think it allows for the most flexibility and therefore the greatest chance of having a successful project.
Yeah, I think, having the flexibility is really important because each project's going to be different depending on where it is and who it is and all the stuff that goes with it. Putting some kind of a minimum percentage in the code or the ordinance, I think is really a problem.
It pigeonholes you.
Yeah, but by the same token, we've got to have something in there that says you got to have some, commercial. But how much and how that's configured? Yeah.
Yeah, depends. It's your classic attorney answer. No. Offense to current presence.
I use that all the time. No offense taken.
Yeah. Well, it is. I mean, and it really does. It depends. So is the commission just okay with how that's written, or should we put a minimum of? I just don't know how you do that.
I don't either.
I have something that's not totally substantive, but I think the phrase, right before the 3 points listed there, B, little I, little 2I, I don't know how you say that, little 3I. The phrase subject to is useful in some contexts, but when I think there's actually quite a bit of case law about the ambiguous nature of subject to when it's used in a mandatory phrasing. So, okay. Because what that would say is subject to implies maybe it's one, maybe it's all, maybe it's none.
Or it's subjective.
Yeah. So I guess if my suggestion would be is however we say 1, 2, and 3, whatever those get decided, it says something like, the following requirement shall apply to all commercial square footage, 1, 2, and 3. So it's clear that it's all 3 and that all 3 must be included. But that's like I said, not it wasn't really on the question.
No, I mean, I think that's good feedback. And let's see. I think I was using some of the existing language, but I think we can change that. So yeah, I mean, the commercial square footage shall meet the following requirements.
Yeah, that works.
Although I think if we're going to, do we want to put a minimum in? I mean, I think
that's really a problem. But there's got to be something in there that says you've got to have commercial, but putting some minimum in there. Yeah. But then it leaves it so subjective that.
Yeah, like I know it's very difficult. And even the ground floor commercial is required on buildings which front arterial and collector streets. Well, what's arterial and what's collector? We do have a major streets plan identified in our code, but I don't even think Flint was identified as a.
It used to be a major street is what it's called. I don't know if the code is still the same.
Yeah, and so if we're using this terminology, right, like it's really not consistent with what we've defined in our code, which I think is chapter 8. But I think the sentiment, right, is that we want to have that frontage, or we want to have that commercial on those really good frontage streets that have the vehicle counts.
Can you just mimic the statement that's above in the ordinance where it says, the final mix of commercial square footage and residential square footage shall be determined based on the specific characteristics of the project site and shall be approved by the city council. So can you just say something like a satisfactory proportion of the two as determined by the city council? That's basically what the ordinance says, but then you just build it into your requirements that's going to have to be ironed out and approved ultimately by the city council.
So,
And that may not be the best word, I don't know, but
a reasonable, satisfactory, I mean, that's the thing, is what's reasonable? I don't know, what's satisfactory?
But like the
Whatever
ordinance
satisfies
says,
3 to 5.
it's based on the project, right? And
Yeah. I mean, Melinda, didn't you deal with a fair amount of mixed use in Murray? And how did you deal with it there?
Well, first of all, by the end of my time there, we had, I think, 6 different mixed-use zones.
Yeah.
And that's how we did it. And we had a light, a medium, and kind of a heavy mixed-use zone. We had a TOD zone because we had the front runner and tracks.
Right.
And so that's how, honestly, that's how a lot of cities will do it, is that they'll end up essentially crafting a
Specific
a
zones.
zone specific to a project or some corner of their city.
Yeah.
I think we could get away with this as we have it written, but and one reason, because we do have that kind of that bailout caveat that says any of these standards identified in the chapter can be changed if the council feels like there's a superior alternative. But yeah, I mean, when I left, we had 6 different mixed-use zones, and we had revised them 4 different times in my 3 years.
I mean, I wonder if you could put language in. I know you don't normally really like to do this, but to say something like, we we recommend that, a minimum of 30% be commercial, but that's subject to review and negotiation or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we could start with that, just like a minimum of 30% of, and again, I mean, do we go by the footprint? Do we go by the overall square footage? Could say something like, in general, should be at least 30%, but that it would be based on the I kind of like that satisfactory amount.
Or you could say a minimum 30%, like you've got here, but then put some, weasel language in there that says that requirement may be modified upon.
But could that be built into the process and not so much the ordinance? I mean, could that be as part of the application or the approval
back and forth
process?
negotiations with staff.
But staff is
Yeah.
basically like,
Yeah.
this is what we shoot for,
Right.
rather than building it into the ordinance.
Yeah.
I think point 2 here, if we say satisfactory portion, that's, to me at least, that's redundant to the final mix sentence. Because the final mix of commercial space, that sentence says the city council is going to approve it in the development agreement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then point 2 basically says
We're gonna
satisfactory
do it.
portion is approved in the development agreement. Well, that's what satisfactory is, totally subjective to the city council. So
Right.
whatever they decide is
So
satisfactory.
you
It goes
just
in the
take that
development
out.
agreement.
Yeah. So, I mean, we could just remove that
The legislative
portion.
process.
Well, should there just be a statement that there needs to be some of the footprint that is commercial? I mean, maybe that's what you have to say. Because, I mean, I guess you can't, the satisfactory portion can't be 0, okay? I think that's maybe what we need to say
Sure.
into.
There has
Well,
to be.
and we could just take out II and
What-
just leave it that we want
And just rely on the upper
we want
portion.
ground floor commercial.
What if you said, before 1, 2, and 3, you say, the total square footage of the project shall meet the following requirements. And then one point is, there must be commercial. I mean, this is thinking out loud here. If you just say there has to be some commercial and the council decides what ratio there is in the development agreement, that implies that some portion is going to be commercial, whatever that council feels.
Yeah.
But then again, that just leaves, that's totally subjective.
Yeah, it really is.
It could be 5,000 square feet 1 year, new council comes in, it's 50,000 square feet.
Yeah.
Or it depends on who it is.
Yeah, right, oh, right, exactly. Which
Well,
is bad.
Yeah.
And obviously, if it's not satisfactory, right, it's not going to be, I mean, the development agreement
Uh-huh.
wouldn't be approved. Yeah, it's a
tricky.
conundrum. Because you want to make sure you get that, but then again, what's the best way to be sure you get that? And maybe it's just taking that whole section out and we just kind of say subject to the following. It has to be ground floor commercial on those arterial and collectors, and surface parking isn't considered towards the commercial space requirement.
So who out there around the state would we say has successful mixed-use commercial zones or mixed-use zones? And then how do they deal with it?
Well, that's right. I mean, that's a very subjective.
Yeah.
Because I can tell you this, that in my last place of employment, I think the planning division and like the people that are legitimate planners, not just like me, but legitimate planners, they loved the fire clay area that was, it's north of 4500 South, and it's the track station that's right there. They love that area. They think it's great. They think it's walkable. They think, you know, it actually was mentioned in some planning articles and planning magazines is a good example. But everyone who lived in Murray, all the elected officials hated it because, again, the structured parking never got built, and so people were lining the streets with vehicles. There was a lot of affordable housing in it, and it was very dense. And you know, there was the community and the public safety hated it because of all the street parking, and they also were allowed to construct more narrow streets. And then with the lined parking on the streets, public safety hated it, so council hated it, the community hated it. I think probably some of the people that lived there hated it because the parking was so terrible. So that's a really subjective question.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some areas that I think have been really well done, but somebody else might not. Like, I think Sugar House is fantastic.
Yeah.
Everyone
I'll tell
in the
you,
history
though,
of my time in Murray came forward and told me they hated Sugar House and they don't want Murray to be a sugar house.
Well, a lot of the residents that were already living in Sugar House, when we were doing that, they complained bitterly.
Yeah.
They did not like what was happening.
Well, it was a huge change from what was there. And is it well done? You know, again, I think beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
Yes.
Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to think of, you know, any other projects that downtown Ogden has done some decent mixed-use projects, the Junction area.
And I think Ogden, though, is the exception to the rule, because I think they work hand in glove across planning, RDA, and developer to get the product they want. I think they've got a process whereby they work through it. They've been at this a while.
Yeah, it's been 20 years, and that's another thing too that I would say that, you know, there are individuals in the planning community that think, you know what, that type of development really takes time, and so it might be 15 years that commercial sits vacant until it really catches on. That's just something that you either have to be okay with, or maybe you just don't get as much commercial up front as you would like to have.
And to that point, Clearfield found that out. They had a requirement, I think it was about 50% commercial to 50% residential. And when you drive up Main Street right across from City Hall, there's vacancy there because they didn't realize what the mix should be. And we talked to J.J. Allen about it because they required too much commercial versus residential.
Well, and then you don't get any projects because residential is really where the cash flow comes in. The lease rates, you know, I mean, even the Millstream partners were saying that, you know, they're only doing the commercial because the city wants it. It doesn't pencil out for them, but it's the density that they, you know, the 82 units that they get, that will be the income stream that will help them kind of augment the commercial areas.
And the commercial will come along eventually. My guess is they'll sell the commercial off and keep the This is what usually happens in mixed use. I mean, having been on the development side, is they'll keep the residential and sell the commercial.
Well, so it sounds like you're as perplexed as I have been about this, which is good that we're all in the same place.
I think to Josh's point, maybe that is the best approach is just to take out item 2, rely on what the ordinance states above, and then I think it'd be valuable for the city council to determine what would be the guideline given and build that into the process. If it's 30%, so developers know in the agreement that that's what we'll shoot for, somewhat as a minimum with maybe some exception, or whatever the city council feels like is the right proportion.
And I actually like the word that was there, the final mix. I don't like that, but I think proportion is a better word. Okay, well, so if you're comfortable with this, then we'll just move on to the next section.
Yeah.
This again just goes back to phasing, which we mentioned before, but that was in there again. The LI zone can also have mixed use overlay, again taking out the pets. Now I did have the city attorney today said, I don't know, do we want to say that we would allow public utility stations if they're owned by the city as some additional flexibility? I think there's a chance that we don't really need more utility substations in the city, and but would we want to give that flexibility? But once again, I took what was a conditional use permit and just pushed it up to the permitted uses. I have the same language from this as was in the section we just discussed, and so we would just take this part out.
Yep.
And I would change that, I guess, to proportion. If that's, the final mix, I think, is, I don't know, we could do mixed tapes back from the 80s, but it is more of a proportion of commercial to residential. And once again, it just says the phasing would be determined by the development agreement, but setting up that expectation that the commercial space would have to come before the residential. So this is where I added in, public utility stations, if they aren't owned by the city, we wouldn't want them in storage units. We don't want those in our mixed-use projects. Any comments on this section?
That's it.
Okay. So I'll finesse that other language up there and just make sure that the not owned by the city part is consistent with what we want here. Now, Steve, we're getting into that height regulation.
Sorry, I was ahead of you.
What was that?
Sorry, I was ahead of you.
That's all right.
Because that did come up in that meeting the other night.
It did.
Yeah, having been on that side and having this discussion with fellow city, I mean, it becomes onerous if you can't build and can't attract the businesses because you can't get the clear heights inside your buildings.
Yeah. Well, and I would hope and think that anybody who's bringing a project to us would have the experience to know that. So we do have the minimum height of 12 feet for that main floor of a building on the major streets. And actually I'm looking at this and I don't know, I may want to change that language with major street to make sure it's consistent with how we had it worded above.
Yeah.
So it would be arterial or collector.
Does I guess a question that I think, a question to clarify after is whether our major street plan, defines arterial and collector.
So it does, and I think we should. I don't know how old that code is. It's probably something we should revisit. I can pull it up. Let me just go to that real quick and just show you what it looks like.
Because I think the idea of this works for those streets that I think we could all probably list as what one would presume are major.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, our arterials, I don't even know why we list I-15. I don't know why we list any of those arterials, because they're not even ours. But the minor arterials, I mean, that's what I would list as our arterials. And I suppose that, yes, they are arterials, but they're not even our roads, so we have no say over them. Right, I mean, we could have a big mixed-use project come in off of Main Street, and UDOT could just completely shoot it down because they don't want the increase in intensity for access. So, so this is what we have listed as the minor arterials, and then the collector street. Like I said, you know, Flint Street carries about 8,500 vehicles a day. Is that a minor arterial or just an arterial? I mean, do we have major arterial? I don't know. I don't know how recent this has been, how recent it's been looked at. But I do think that there are some things in here that might benefit from changing and making more clear. But if we use that language and refer back to this code, yes, Main Street, 200 North are our minor arterials, and then our collector streets are Andrew, Flint, Sunset, Fairfield, Burton, Shepherd. So those would be the ones that we would say, okay, if you're fronting Sunset, if you're fronting Fairfield, Burton, you would have to have ground floor commercial. But I think, yeah, we just want to make that language consistent. And then with this awesome numbering that we have here, number 1, 1, I'll clean that up. One of the things that I was trying to do is allow for the opportunity of a hotel to come in that would need to have 4 stories, but not get 4 stories of apartments. And I don't think Kaysville community would really want a 4-story apartment. I think I could say I don't really think the council would love that either. But if we had a building that was exclusively for commercial uses, like a hotel, which is something that Phil Holland is trying to bring into that property right there off of 4th West and that fronts I-15, I think we would be very amenable to having a building that is taller than 35 feet. So with this section, I was trying to accomplish limiting just strictly residential only buildings and trying to get that commercial benefit out of that, with giving flexibility to that height for, I mean, if somebody wanted to bring in a 4-story office building, I think we might be amenable to that as well. But I was trying to limit the ability for just 4 or 5-story apartments to come in. And my understanding too, with just when this ordinance was drafted and written and adopted, that there was kind of a sentiment with, I know for sure at least one council member, but the council as a whole, that they really didn't care whether or not we got any mixed-use projects that came into the city. And so some of the, I think, finer points that need to be in the ordinance just weren't worked on because it was kind of just going through the motions more with some of the elected officials. That is what I have been told. And so, again, going back to this, would we want to have a higher height allowance for certain uses? And I think the answer to that would be yes. But obviously that's ultimately the council's decision, but I'd like to see what the Planning Commission thinks about that. Next section. Okay.
This
Yeah.
I don't want to gum up the works here, but I think, I mean, my preference would be to keep it, when we talk about streets, just say major street, because I think that the history of Kaysville has been all of those streets designated that we looked at in that table are major streets. And if we just said arterial or collector, well, okay, never mind. I mean, principal arterial or minor arterial are both arterials. And then what else is there? Is there just collector? That's it? And significant local streets.
But we're not including those.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and those significant local streets, I mean, I think we're getting more into residential areas
Right.
anyway.
Yep.
But they probably wouldn't be a great place to attract any type of commercial.
Yeah. So, arterial or collector works, never mind.
Okay, well, we cleaned up some of this. I do want to say thank you, Paul Allred went through this. He wasn't able to be here tonight, but he went through this and gave me some additional comments that I thought were worth putting in. So, you know, this would just say, look, if you're, so back to the Flint Street project, you know, if you were abutting a residential dwelling, that's not where we want big, tall buildings to be. And so this builds in that sensitivity into the ordinance that maybe some developers might not have. But if it's across the street, maybe a building 30 feet tall is okay. And then, you know, what's an accessory building? I don't know, maybe somebody wanted to put in a tall gym and, you know, it was saying no accessory building shall exceed 15 feet in height. If there was, you know, somebody wanted to add in a community or a community room that had the ability to have volleyball in there, you would want a taller ceiling. And so I just...
A climbing gym?
Yeah, sure, yeah. Although that wouldn't be a detached accessory, but it could be an accessory use, like an amenity to a development.
I was in a project with Graystar where they had that on the exterior of their main office, and so they had their gym and then they had the climbing wall.
That's kind of cool. I like that idea, actually.
On that, I prefer district or zone, where between dwelling, where it says dwelling or district. Because if you put dwelling, that could be read to say, well, yeah, it abuts a residential zone, but the dwelling is 80 feet away. So I could go higher than 30. If you say zone instead of dwelling, or district is probably fine, then it means if your property abuts the residential zone, unless there's a road in between, it doesn't matter how close the dwelling is, you can't exceed 30 feet.
So you'd rather just have it go back to district?
That would be, I mean, I'm just looking at it with my attorney eyes, and I see dwelling, I could be like, hey, it doesn't say residential zone, it says residential dwelling, and that dwelling is a long ways away from my commercial property, so I can go higher than 35 or 30 feet.
Yeah, and I mean, there have been instances, right, where like a residential district, we have our agricultural district, but there may be a residence on that property. So
that's what the dwelling was trying to get at?
Correct. But we could say residential dwelling or residential district. But that was the attempt for that.
I see.
And sometimes properties get rezoned, but somebody's still living there, and it's zoned commercial now. But then again, maybe in that instance, we're hoping that it would redevelop, and we wouldn't want to. I mean, I'm not saying we want to give a protection to an existing residence, but in that case, it would protect the dwelling regardless of the zone.
Yeah. That's a good point. I guess I'm still tripped up on abutting then. Because when you say zone abutting a zone, that means the lines on the map touch. I think
Sure.
that's what the average Joe person would think. But when you say a dwelling abutting, that's an actual physical structure. How close do you have to be to abut? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now we're getting in the weeds here.
Well, and so we could just, we could just take that out of, 50 feet of a residential dwelling. Does that?
There you go. Yeah, that helps. Yeah, abutting, yeah, yep.
Don't worry about the abutting.
Yeah.
So that just says, it doesn't matter the district, as long as the dwelling is there.
Yeah.
Yep, there you go.
Okay. And obviously abutting, well, we took care of that. Because if it's abutting, it's not across the street. That
Right.
wouldn't meet the definition. So I did increase some of the height requirements in here. I mean, I can't imagine anybody wanting to come in and build anything less than 12 feet or 13 feet, but it did increase the minimum requirements there.
That's probably smart with some of the commercial stuff and the needs for HVAC.
Yeah, I mean, it would be a bad project if somebody wanted to come in and build a 10-foot tall building. And this building, the old library is taller than 10 feet. Let's see.
With the sacred
And
law.
so this was, again, attempting to try and accommodate the ability for a really great commercial opportunity without allowing just like,
Is that 50 feet to like the peak, or is that to the clear height? I mean, how do you define
so
that?
it would just go back to the way height is defined in the rest of our
Right,
ordinance.
Right.
Perfect. I just don't want any ambiguity.
Yeah, no, I agree. So this was something that I think was lacking in the ordinance is. So it says like the yard and lot requirements will be that of the underlying zone. Well, if we're building, and this is a perfect example on Flynn Street, and we handled it through the development agreement, but if you're building a commercial building, we want that pulled out to the street. We don't want, if the underlying zone is RM and our setback is 25 feet on a corner or 20 feet for the front yard setback, we don't want that. We want that commercial building to be pulled out to the street. That's where you get the pedestrian-friendly, pedestrian-oriented, and so I'm just making it very apparent that we would handle that through a development agreement. Because again, I think it does end up being a little bit site-specific, and there may be a reason to pull building a little bit further back or even bring it a little bit closer. So, so this just clarifies that, hey, it may work to have those underlying requirements, it may not. But we would want to go more with if it's a commercial building, we would want to have the commercial setbacks and not those residential setbacks.
I have a suggestion on the 4 or 50.
On-
4 stories or 50 feet in
okay.
height.
Uh-huh.
I think the intent there is that it's capped at 50 feet, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I would say, you would say something like, shall not exceed 4 stories or a maximum of 50 feet in height.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or you would say 4 stories or 50 feet in height, whichever is lower, or something like that. So it's clear that it's not an either or. Because someone could come in and say, hey, it's 4 stories, and it's an
more
or,
than 50.
but it's more than 50, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think I like or a maximum.
Yeah. Well, let's see, does that, I'm, again, thinking out loud here. I don't know if that solves, let me read it again.
Well, in theory, if we just left it at 4 stories, right? Like somebody could be like, oh, well, I'm doing 4 20-foot stories.
That's what I mean.
8-foot tall
Should be
building.
an
Yeah.
And that-
or.
And that's where, even if somebody is trying to be crafty like that, I wonder if they could still read it that way.
Because of your,
Because they would say, hey, I'm still 4 stories.
yeah,
And it
You
said I
maybe
have to be
need-
either 4 stories or 50 feet.
yeah. That or probably needs to be an and.
Okay.
4
yeah,
stories is a
so-
maximum of 50.
And shall not exceed.
Or should it be nor? Shall not exceed 4 stories nor a maximum of 50 feet.
Or nor, yeah, maybe so.
Nor 4 stories shall not let's see.
Well,
Well, what if we just said shall not exceed 50 feet in height?
Yeah.
well, then again, you open up to, you could get a 5-story project. And maybe that's okay, if that's what the intent is. But that's the issue with just going with straight height. Because they're,
Because of story height.
yeah, because you could do, well, okay, I'm gonna do 9-foot, I'm gonna do 9-foot stories, and now I can get 5 floors. Or I'm gonna do, the ground floor would have to be 13 feet, right? They could get 5 stories, and I just don't know if that's what we want. And now, if you're okay with that, then we can take this forward with a recommendation of the council to allow that.
Yeah,
But
I mean,
the number of stories doesn't necessarily equate to height.
right. I guess, in my view, which may be the minority, the height is more the consideration. If a creative architect can have a building do what it needs to do
What do you got?
with 5 stories and 50 feet of height, then sure, but I don't know. I'm not,
Does that work?
shall not exceed with a maximum of 50 feet in height.
So if we're okay, I can just kind of note here
Yeah.
that what
Yeah.
we want to do is limit no more than 50 feet, but also no more than 4 stories. And we can, we would just need to break that out
Yeah,
and have 2 separate. They shall not exceed 4 stories and shall not exceed 50 feet in height.
Yeah.
and shall, yeah,
Or,
Just repeat the shall not on the second.
oops, what happened there?
there you go. I think that
Exceed.
Shall not exceed.
50
I don't even think you need a
shall
maximum.
not exceed 50 feet in height,
Yeah, you can take out the maximum.
or you just keep them, yeah.
There we go. That,
It doesn't.
I think that works, right?
okay. Let's see. Okay, we already talked about that part. All right, just clarifying initially, right, that it'll be community development that does that review. This is interesting, it has to be consistent with the community's vision.
What is the community's vision?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, depends on who you ask, because if your vision is gonna be different than Mindy's.
Yeah, you need some kind of an
Wh-
adopted.
Why wouldn't you say consistent with the general plan for the proposed location?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that would probably be better.
okay, I had that same thought.
Because in theory, that
That is
encapsulates the community's vision.
Yeah,
It should.
agreed.
Yeah, let me just talk through this for just a second though, because we had, that Flint project was slated in the future land use map to be residential. So,
Which, by the way, that slipped through the cracks, because I know personally myself, and I think amongst others, I said that 2 or 3 times.
Yes.
That needs to be shown on the map
Yes.
as mixed
Yeah.
use.
Yes,
Agreed.
I remember
And it
that.
never got done.
Never got done.
okay.
So,
Right.
I
Well,
think it's fine.
Yeah, I think there was another part of the general plan that showed that as mixed use. So we just changed that to be consistent with the general plan, but then if there is that discrepancy like we had over there, it doesn't say consistent with the future land use map, it says the overall general plan, right? So.
yeah, so there's
some-
room for argument on either side, and then the legislators get to decide, I suppose.
Yeah.
Okay. I think this is just giving a little bit more flexibility, right? Just depending on the site, what it looks like. Oh, that was just some cleanup. Now, this was something that Commissioner Allred recommended, that 70% of the building be fenestration. Does anybody not know what fenestration is?
Windows.
Yeah, yeah, it's just the, ability to be, it's essentially glass. I don't know enough about good planning principles to know if 50% is adequate, if it needs to be 70. Any thoughts on that, Steve or Will, for other commissioners?
That's a lot of windows, but it might be that way anyway. You know, a retailer or what have you might want that anyway, but.
For a restaurant, you want it. I think it would depend on the type. You know, office, you may want less.
Should we just, do you want to put it back at 50 or leave it at 70? Any preference?
70 is a ton.
Yeah,
Seems like a lot.
okay. Let's just go back to,
I think we ought to advocate for 80% brick. Like in old Soviet Russia. With lots of gray cement.
well, I think too, sometimes you get those requirements in and you really kind of start limiting the ability of an architect to design something that the building owner would feel like is fitting. All right, those were just some cleanup themes. The ordinance said that in the city center commercial area, we would want 0% to require as open space.
I guess it depends on what's open space.
Very true.
Because I think the idea, my presumption with it being 0% is we don't necessarily want parks in our,
Commercial area.
in the CC, but we do want some landscaping and we want like some, we want some pervious space, ground or whatever. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think, for me, this is my thought, but I think you would want some type of, some open space where people could sit and gather. And maybe it's just 3 of you met there for lunch and there's not enough space for patio, outdoor dining, but you would just want to go sit on the grass.
So if like plazas, urban spaces would fall under the definition of open space, I think that works.
Yes,
Yeah.
and I think that in my mind, I think that would work. Yeah. It's just kind of like a little plaza space where, it's a nice, attractive place for people to stand and visit for a few minutes. So, we could leave it at 0. I put 10%. And I do understand that land in your city center is going to be a lot more precious and a lot more, you want that efficient use of the land, but I also think you don't want to have a project where there's nowhere that people can feel comfortable and feel drawn to.
I know people hate it when you compare it to other cities, but look at Bountiful, what they've done. They've done that skating rink and that gathering area. So you kind of have a nice municipal open use. I think it's depending on how you use it. And depending, what you want to use, in my opinion, you want to have a place where you can place make and you can have people come to and gather. You don't want just open space to have open space. You want to be able to utilize it in a way that is valuable and it also is able to, be conducive to your.
Yeah, it needs to be functional and that was one of the arguments that a citizen who was against the Flint Street project that was making that you're just counting all the remnant space in between the townhomes as open space. And yes, it was calculated, but they had a functional park that they were providing. It was right next to the rail trail, and you're across the street from the park. And so in that instance, you may not need to have a big requirement of open space because those amenities are already built into the area.
And I think, there's another city I've studied, like Gilbert, Arizona, has done a good job of this, where they've opened their open space and allowed their downtown to become an open, but you've got walking space, you've got parking, your parking setback. I think you have to allow for both development and for place people to go, but it's just like you said, not all of it can be like in that development on Flint, not all of it can count because you have other municipal space or open space that's around it. So, I mean, it's going to be, it's project driven.
Do we want to leave these percentage requirements, or do we even just say there shall be provided a minimum improved open space within each development determined on or based on the development agreement? I mean, I think I understand why they were trying to make more. It was RM underlying zone, why they would want more with the RM versus commercial and industrial. But, you know, do we even need to define that, or we just say it has to be provided? And like I said, you look at that based on the specifics of the project. I mean, if it's right across the street from Barnes Park or right adjacent to Barnes Park, maybe we don't need to have 20%. I don't know.
Yeah.
I like that better.
So we could just take all that out and just say, you know, determined based on the development agreement, and not even put a percentage, or want to just leave the percentage in for a baseline?
But if you just delete it as that's highlighted, then you got to deal with the word minimum. So you would say something like, there shall be provided
So we just say there shall be
improved
provided
open space within each
functional and
development.
improved. Maybe do functional. I think the word functional is used in the RM zone, that it has to be functional, usable, open space, and that doesn't include, right, your park strips. But so we would just say there shall be provided functional,
It's a better term.
provided
'Cause
functional.
I love when you go to development and their open space is the retention pond.
Yeah, no.
And the kids are playing.
That's functional.
Yeah.
And the kids are playing soccer in it.
It has a
Well,
function.
Mindy told me she was swimming over here at Lake Fiesta on Tuesday.
In my Arctic plunge.
But you know what? North Ogden City turned in a detention basin into a dog park.
No, it works. It's,
Yeah. But you're right. I mean, if it's a detention basin, is that really functional open space? Well, I guess not unless you like muddy shoes all the time. But so maybe we just put in there
our
has to
baseball
be
field this time was
provided,
a detention basin.
you know, functional improved open space as determined by the development agreement.
Yeah.
Or just leave it at that. Something like that, just, you know, within each development. And then, something like that.
Sure.
Okay. Well, we'll go with that. Just added a couple more things in there, stairs and ramps. So parking was another thing that I wanted to talk about. And in my experience, in every community I've worked in Utah, it's been a real struggle to get projects parked correctly. And people hate it when residents will hate it when other residents park on the street all the time. And so when I was in Murray with our mixed-use zones, we went through rounds and rounds of discussions between public works and engineering and community development as to what parking ratios should be. Community development wanted them to be lower. Public works, they hate for snow plowing, they hate for street maintenance, street sweeping, they hate to have the on-street parking. And so thankfully, here we're not quite as adversarial as it has been in other places that I've worked, but parking is a challenge. And I know that the trends are, as Steve mentioned earlier, trends are to go away and not even have a minimum parking requirement. However, if you get a developer that just wants to, you know, a project doesn't have the mindset of caring whether or not a project is underparked, they'll take every reduction that they can. And I did have a project like that come through when I was in Murray, and it's going to be a real burden on the neighborhood when that project is finished. We just had, I think, some parking reductions that were way too generous, and this project in particular just took advantage of every single one that was offered in the code. So I was trying here to say, first of all, here's the minimum parking requirements. I think what I have listed here, in the end, kind of just, I think it balances out. But what it also does is it causes those who are developing the projects to think twice about putting in a bunch of 3-bedroom units. And so we have the smaller units, studio, 1-bed, 2-bedroom, that tend to be a little bit more affordable anyway. And those 3-bedroom or larger just are not going to be a large amount of those in the project because the parking requirements will eke up and make that difficult to park. I also wanted to make sure that if we are going to do a parking reduction, that we have an analysis to fall back on that says, here's what would be, here's what would be reasonable, so that it's not just Melinda sitting across the table from the developer arguing about this bus stop is never used and I want a 10% reduction. It's data that we're working with, and it's an unbiased, similar to the traffic impact studies. So that was what I was attempting to do here. Now, I'll also go back to the project that we had at the City Council last week, where in the end, I had a couple council members that were like, I will not, it's a hard no with me on this whole project unless we built in, more visitor parking. Was the project underparked? I don't really think so.
I don't think so
They fit a bunch
either.
of parking on the streets, city street, standard width.
And-
Yes, they could have.
And I think also on that one with the commercial, that commercial wasn't going to be used in the evenings. And I think where you're going to have some give and take is on that commercial.
Yeah, and there may be some projects, right, that have that, the shared use that really works well. But again, if you were to have a hotel right next to an apartment complex, that doesn't really work for shared space. And so we would want to have some type of a study to fall back on to rationalize that with the council. And another thing too, which we get into just a little bit further down here, but the parking reductions, I want to make sure that we're making those concessions based on valid data. So just because you have a bus stop out in front of your project doesn't mean that anybody uses it.
And it doesn't make you automatically a transit-oriented development.
Right. And the truth is, in Kaysville, we just don't have good transit. And, we had an experience probably 4 weeks ago where a young couple came in. They had both received parking tickets because they were parked on the street overnight, and of course they didn't know about our parking ordinance, and they were frustrated. But I think it's a fourplex that they were in, didn't have enough parking. And here it is, they're a young family, but they both have 2 cars. One of their cars actually wouldn't fit, or both of their cars, I don't think, fit underneath the covered parking that they had in there, because it's pretty old. Vehicles are a lot taller than they used to be. But my whole point is, one of the worst things you can ever do is underpark a project. But at the same time, one of the worst things you can do is totally overpark a project. And so what that mix is, again, it's hard to say, but I would say if we're going to do that, we need to look at data that's coming from people that, do traffic and parking studies. My belief is that the numbers that I have put in front of you are more in line with the ULI standards that they have out there. And again, what it's going to do is it's going to say, look, we don't want these big, huge 3-bedroom units. We don't want a whole, 2 stories of those. They're not going to want to put in that much parking. But does this address the guest parking? Does it address the parking for, visitors? Or, for the couples that have 2 cars? I don't know. It's just kind of hard to say, but I was attempting with this to try and get closer to what would, I think, be more practical. And again, if push comes to shove, right, we can always have what happened to the council where it's like, look, I will be a hard no on this until they build more parking in. And that's, you know, thankfully the council just said, figure out where it fits best, but we want 7 more spots. We could just leave it to that and leave these as they are. But I did want to limit the amount of the reduction because I think we had listed up to was it 25%? But if you think about that, if there's a project that would require 200 parking spots and we grant up to a 25% reduction, that's 50 spots. And that seems like really heavy. Yes. Yeah. Too much. So, you know, do we even put a percentage in, or we just say, look, based on a parking study, that's what we'll do? I don't know.
I think that's,
Okay.
yeah, I think you do based on the study.
So we'll just finesse this language then to just say maybe reduced on an amount determined based on a parking analysis.
Although the parking analysis is going to be bought and paid for by the developer.
Yeah.
So the consultant who prepares it has professional standards that they need to adhere to. But as any litigator will tell you, expert witnesses say the opposite thing all the time. So, I mean, but it does accomplish your goal of at least some objectivity, some objective data. So maybe it's good enough.
Okay. Well, I'll just finesse that paragraph down to just not have a percentage in and just say that it'll be reduced based on what an analysis comes in and whatever the council, right? I mean, because the council in the end, they can say, you know what, we don't agree with this. We feel like, you know, we feel like it's too much and this is what we're comfortable with. I will tell you another thing that I've learned in my experience is that everyone is an expert on parking.
Right.
What's that?
Everyone is an expert on parking.
Oh, yeah.
Parking ratios, how much parking is needed,
Yeah,
everyone's
yeah.
an expert, especially when there's not enough to go around. So we'll make that change. Now this was so initially in my draft, I had taken all of this out for the reason of I'm sorry, but right now, Kaysville doesn't have good transit. I had eliminated all of this based on the moderate income housing that was finally adopted by the City Council with our general plan. This was one element that they added in that we had not had in the draft that came to the Planning Commission. So I put this back in, but I have made those reductions a lot more gentle. And this was one of the things that I was saying earlier. I did change this. So for some reason, the quarter mile came before the 1/8 of a mile. So I put 1/8 of a mile first, quarter of a mile, and so I had those numbers reversed. I had a greater reduction at a quarter mile. I had 10% anyway. So I fixed that 10% within an 1/8 of a mile of a transfer stop. 5% within a quarter of a mile. I still feel like that's pretty generous. But what I've again listed up in here is that those requests have to come with numbers that would come from the UTA on what those ridership numbers are. So that it's not just like, well, here's a bus stop, so I want to put more residential units in and reduce my parking. And so I just really softened that, and I don't know if there's any thoughts on if that's too stringent or not, but I do kind of feel like it's Kaysville appropriate.
Yeah, it's Kaysville appropriate. We have the Route 70, that's about the biggest transit we've got.
Well, you know, and I think, yeah, I mean, people do take the bus to come to the DTC, but that's their destination.
Yeah.
That's not, you know, they're not going to get on the bus to go commute up to their job in Ogden or down to Salt Lake because it's just not And they're gonna get in their car and they're gonna drive to Farmington Station if they're gonna take the.
I mean, we do have the express buses, but they have, they have their own lots.
Yeah. Okay, so we should just leave that then, the commission's comfortable with that. I did want to add in an element, curb management has been a big thing over the last few years, especially, right, we like to get our DoorDash and we have multiple deliveries a day. And so I wanted to make sure that a project would have a plan for that.
Yeah.
Even a plan to, hey, I'm moving in, where do I put my moving truck? You gotta be able to have a loading and an unloading zone when people are moving into an apartment and out of an apartment. So this is something that I've added in.
That's perfect. I mean, one of the things that projects we were doing, we always had an Amazon locker. But there's also, there's a whole different network out there for that. I mean, there's apps, all that kind of stuff. Greystar uses a whole management plan for this. Anyway, it's interesting to see when you're in that world, but yeah, that's a needed thing.
Okay. I'm again just setting up an expectation that we're going to have a traffic study. I've been talking with somebody else about a mixed-use project over here off of 200 North and 200 West. I think it would be like 6 units and a 2-story office building. I don't think we need a traffic study for that, but I want to make sure that that expectation is set up, that we do want to have those traffic studies when it's appropriate. So, let's see. I think we're getting pretty close to the end here. I think that actually is this is what we do have for the signs right here, Steve. So it just refers back to our other code. And I think that's actually the end. So that was kind of a long discussion. Is there any other additional thoughts, or are we comfortable with this where it is?
I'd say make the changes and then bring it back and let's have another look.
Bring it back?
Yeah.
Okay, we can probably bring it back at the next meeting then, back on the 26th. We do have a public hearing scheduled for this tonight as well, so you could open up the public hearing and close, or we could, push that. We could advertise again, whatever the...
I think we should just push it to when, after we have the discussion with the finalized document.
Okay, so we can just re-advertise for another public hearing on the 26th. Okay. Well, thank you. I know it was kind of a longer discussion, but I appreciate the thoughts. And I think it's not going to be perfect in ordinances, but I think we're better to, a more straightforward ordinance. So we'll make those changes, bring it back on the 26th, and we'll reschedule or re-advertise, renotice for the public hearing. So, yeah, do you want to make a motion to do that, or?
I think we should probably have a motion to table.
Yeah, do another date-specific motion, since we have a public hearing scheduled, is what we like to see.
Yep.
Make a motion to table consideration of whatever this chapter is.
27.
And until we see the changes that we talked about this evening and have a further discussion at that time.
I'll second.
Okay. I'll start with the voting. Aye.
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 Okay, the motion passes unanimously.
Well, we had a fake number 6 on the agenda, or a ghost number 6, but we can fill it.
Well, seeing there's no public here, we'll bypass the call to public. Do you have any matters of reports, correspondence, or calendar items to share tonight?
No, I don't think so. Just thanks to the commission for the hard work on the mixed-use project that went to the council, and that did pass 5-0. It was a really, I think, a great result. I think it's a really good project for Kaysville to have a little mixed use. I think the density is appropriate for the city. Other than that, I don't know if you've all heard, but Shane Scott, our city manager, has been appointed to the Summit County manager, and he'll be leaving, I think his last day with city is February 6th. So we're super sad to be losing him. And I think the city got the position opened up yesterday. So
It was on League and City and Towns this morning.
what was that?
It was on the League and City and Towns this morning.
Oh, yeah, it was on there. I think it was on there yesterday.
Yeah.
So it's out there, and we just are crossing our fingers that we get someone that was as great as Shane. We wish him luck in his new endeavors, and can't think of anything else. Other than, Will, you want to discuss the legislative session at all? You're like, nope. I read both your emails.
I just sent you the article. They've announced what's coming, so it's out in the media. It's on KSL tonight. There is an affordable housing bill, partly of kind of what Will's talked about, the APA and some other things. They want to pare down how the process for subdivisions is done. They want to take that out. They also talked about more penalties for cities that don't have moderate income housing. And then their rumor is, I work with somebody who is in the state legislature, the legislature is talking about major changes to zoning and letting the market decide how zoning's done. I don't know what that's going to look like, but they're going to tinker. Yeah. And I just shake my head because I'm just like, more government involvement doesn't always, I don't think they're trying to deregulate, but we don't want to be Houston, but we don't want to be, there's been some discussions. There's a guy who's been writing articles lately about get rid of all zoning, would make housing more affordable. I don't believe that. I think there's actually some more deregulation that needs to happen within the codes, to clean the codes up. But I'm not a big fan of the state just stepping in and saying, let's get rid of all zoning.
Well, I think they're bound and determined to point the finger at cities for being the bad guy and to do whatever it is that they want to do. So, you know what? At the end of the session, we'll wrap our heads around everything they threw at us, and we'll do our best to try and become compliant. It's exhausting to even think about what they have coming down the pipeline for all the changes.
I always joke it's the 45-day hostage session.
Yeah. It's really regrettable that they have just, I know there are cities out there that have not been as reactive as the legislature would like them to be, and they're kind of thumbing their nose, but it's everybody else who's really paying the price for that. But I do think it's been a pretty unfair sentiment out there that cities aren't doing their part. I know the league just asked us for an updated number on the entitled residential units throughout the whole state. When they asked us earlier this summer, it was like 90,000, and the housing shortage is 30,000. So really, what's the problem? Well, we had a developer ask us to hold off on recording their final plats for as long as we can until they were about to expire, because they don't want to pay the extra taxes on all the additional lots. And now, the economy is such that they don't think they can sell them. But what control do we have over that? So come March, like I said, we'll figure out what else we need to do. And I kind of too feel like the league has just been, I don't want to say that they're not effective, because I think that they are, but I think they've just been beat down so many times, and it's so much coming at them so rapidly and so immensely that they can't keep up.
And I'd also say that you have organizations that should be and aren't. Yeah.
So, buckle up.
Yep. It's going to be an interesting session.
Okay. Anything else? Okay, do we have a motion for adjournment?
So moved.
All right, we're adjourned.
Thank you.